wanted to talk about the nature of edge, or edginess, or whatever you want to call it. So I did some research and I tried to find a good definition of it online, and honestly, I didn't really like any of the ones I found. There isn't really an official definition of edginess, at least in the way that I'm talking about. If you look up edginess, then it tends to be more in the sense of being on edge, you know, being quick to be agitated, that kind of thing. But I couldn't really find a good definition for edgy in the sense of Shadow the Hedgehog. You hear a lot of talk about how he is an edgy character, for instance, but again, I just didn't find a good definition of edgy, and so I had to make my own. And so the best definition of edgy that I was able to come up with is darkness without depth as a means to seem cool. And to break it down a little bit, edginess involves darkness. That's not to say that dark things are inherently edgy, because that is absolutely not the case. But as I said, darkness without depth. I think that edginess plays with darkness in a way that is kind of surface level. If you are edgy, then I think you're willing to deal with darker topics, but I think that you handle them in a way that is superficial. And then my full definition again was darkness without depth as a means to seem cool. I think that there's an element of trying to seem cool to edginess, like you're trying to impress someone or other people. To clarify, dark things are not necessarily edgy, cool things are not necessarily edgy, and then superficial things are not necessarily edgy. But whenever you combine all three of those things, in my opinion, that's when edginess sort of manifests. And so this is the best definition of the word that I was able to cobble together, so please let me know if you have a better one. And so to give you a more complete idea of what edginess is, I feel like it would be a good idea to look at some examples. So like I mentioned earlier, Shadow the Hedgehog is often named as an example of an edgelord, right? Or someone who's edgy. And I think that he fits my definition of edgy pretty well. You know, there were the three parts: the darkness, the superficiality, and the coolness. Shadow the Hedgehog is a darker anti-hero type or villain at times. And then he doesn't seem to have much depth, but this is Sonic the Hedgehog we're talking about after all, so how much depth can you reasonably expect? And then the biggest one of all, you're supposed to think he's cool, right? Because he uses guns and he rides a motorcycle even though he's a fast hedgehog. And so that all bundled together is what makes him edgy. Another popular example is Dante from the Devil May Cry reboot, or Dante as he's sometimes called. This version of Dante is dark and brooding at times, and I don't feel like he has much depth to him, honestly, and he's trying to be cool, right? Or rather, the writers are trying to depict him as cool. And so the player is supposed to think he's cool because he goes out to clubs and he sleeps with strippers and he lives in his RV and whatever else. But the problem is that usually in cutscenes, he just comes off as a jerk. And honestly, I think that 80% of the reason why the Devil May Cry reboot was so poorly received was because of the characterization of Dante. And so I'm kind of talking about edgy characters, but let's talk about works as a whole that could be perceived as edgy. So I'm a big fan of Berserk, right? But it's edgy, let's face it. The series is super grimdark, right? It's super graphic, features a lot of graphic violence and rape, and just, it's gross. It goes a lot of places that other stories wouldn't dare to go. And that doesn't make it bad, right? In my opinion, it's not bad to engage with darkness. But like I said, there's the superficial element to it, because I think a lot of the time, a lot of the violence and, you know, sexual assault and stuff like that just kind of comes across as unnecessary. And then again, the third part of my definition of edgy was that it is trying to be cool, right? And I think that Berserk is trying to be cool. I think that you are expected to think that Guts is a cool character. And so with this, I think that I have to acknowledge that character growth is a thing. And so in his first appearances, Guts comes off as extremely edgy, but then as you progress through the manga and as you realize what turned him into what he is, then you feel some sympathy for him, and then as he gets some companions and allies, his heart seems to open up, and so he grows as a character. But again, I would still consider Berserk as a whole to be edgy. Now, it's worth considering, is edginess a bad thing? Because oftentimes whenever you hear people talk about edginess, it's done in a way that is making fun of it. And really, to answer the question, is edginess a bad thing? I think that it is just kind of in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent. This is one of those things, like I think screamed vocals, for instance. Not everyone likes it. A lot of people don't like any kind of non-clean singing in their songs, but personally I'm a big fan of it, you know, and I can't really explain why, I just kind of like it. And so I can't help but feel that edginess is sort of something like that, where it's something that you may or may not be drawn to, and it's not necessarily a bad thing if you like it, but it can be perceived as such by other people. I think there are a lot of reasons why edginess is so despised by so many people. I think a lot of it has to do with, like I was talking about, the superficiality of it, right? The fact that a lot of things that are perceived as edgy don't have any depth to them, right? There's nothing to grapple with. In my opinion, I think that darkness is very much something to be wrestled with, and it's not really something to be embraced or glorified. And I think that there are a lot of dark topics that you have to kind of give the respect they deserve. And so it feels like some edgy things are kind of making a mockery of some darker subjects. And so is it okay to like stuff that's edgy? Yeah, like what you want. There are a lot of things that I like that are edgy. I mean, I'm freaking wearing a Metallica shirt with an executioner and a bunch of skulls on it. And so, that's pretty edgy, I think. And so at the end of the day, why does this matter? And so I think the best answer I can give is that the illusion of edginess kind of makes your art less respectable. And when I say less respectable, I don't mean that I'm gonna respect it less. I mean that people at large are gonna respect it less. It's hard to take edgy things seriously, and so I think that because of that, people aren't going to give it the same respect and admiration that they might give to something that is perceived as less edgy. And so then the question arises, why should I care if something I love is perceived as edgy? Why should I care what other people think about it? And I think that the answer is that if you're an individual, then you probably shouldn't care, right? You don't need to care. Like, no one's going to come look at my record collection and then be like, oh no, this is edgy, this is gross, blah, blah. Like, people aren't just judging you all the time. I mean, sometimes they are, but you know, usually people aren't judging every little aspect about you and what you like, and so you are free to like and play and read and whatever, anything you want. But I think that you kind of have to look at the big picture whenever it comes to edginess. I think that things that are edgy are oftentimes harder to market, and that means that they're harder to sell, which means that there's less money going towards the creators. And so because of that, I think that edginess has the potential to be a net negative on a work of art. And I think this sort of brings up all kinds of questions about what it means to be a sellout, what it means to make your art more appealing to the masses. Should you sell out, or should you stay true to your original vision, or whatever? Those are questions for another day. And I think that people like a lot of different things because they are edgy, right? That's one of the reasons why people like the metal band Slayer, right? Is because they're edgy, right? Because they sing about Satanism and they sing about the Holocaust and death and murder and serial killers and stuff like that, right? That's one of the big appeals of them. But at the same time, there's a reason why they didn't sell out huge arenas and Metallica did. And whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing is not really the topic that I'm trying to get at, so I'll stray away from this for now. And so some people like edginess, a lot of people don't like it. Ultimately, it's one of those things to where I think you just kind of have to be aware of it. I think you have to be aware of what kind of art you're trying to make. You have to be aware of the audience that it appeals to. Again, to clarify, there are a lot of things that I myself like that a lot of people would classify as edgy, right? You know, I like Dead Space 2 and I consider it to be an edgy game. And so that's not to say that edginess doesn't have a place in the world, right? But rather I just think it's something you have to be aware of. It's something you have to be conscious of. And the reason why I brought up the entire popularity thing, right, and I kind of said that edginess could keep people away from a certain art is because of the fact that video games aren't cheap, right? It's not cheap to make a video game and to fund an entire studio for a couple years while they're making the next Dead Space game. And I think that some things are more niche than others. Not everything is going to sell 5 million copies. But at the end of the day, I think that you kind of have to do what you have to do to keep the lights on. And so I think that's about all I have to say about edginess. Thank you. Have a nice night.